So with the benefit of hindsight, what do Warhammer 40K collectors look back on as some of their best value purchases and pickups? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking good deals in Warhammer 40k, collecting together a few examples of things that might be money well spent if your goal is getting armies of models together on the tabletop. I think it's fair to say that Warhammer 40k is a pretty pricey hobby, probably not the absolute apex of the amount of money that you can spend on certain things out there, but I think it's fair to say that Games Workshop's plastic models don't have an outstanding reputation for being cheap. Perhaps the biggest expenditures tend to be the model kits themselves. Typical squads and vehicles from Games Workshop would cost like £40 or $60 or more for many of them. Then paints, hobby supplies, and transport cases and things might cost a bit more. And 40k is still clinging to the Codex model of charging you to see the rules as well, which can add a bit more still. In general, it means that saving money and being hyper vigilant for good bang for your buck, for how to turn money into the most plastic model soldiers looking nice on the tabletop as possible is quite a big subject. So for this one I thought we'd talk about a few things that might allow that. This one's kind of a counterpart to the video I made a week or so back about the worst deals in 40k. I'll leave that links down in the video description, but for this one I thought we'd jump through a few different areas that stand out as being better value than most. Starting out with perhaps one of the more obvious things, big value discount sets, are one of the first things a lot of people point to as better purchases than the average model kit that they get. It is kind of crazy just how much Games Workshop can vary their miniature prices when they want to. A lot of things come for their kind of standard rate, something like £30 to £40 or $50 to $65 for a typical Warhammer squad of one sort or another. But when they want to lump them together and sell them as a big combined box set to generate more sales, you can often expect around about 25 to 40% off for the majority of combat patrols and battle forces. Then there's some releases, typically edition starter sets, that are just far beyond that. Things like Leviathan and some of the starter sets, which are more in the region of 60 to 70% off. So it is kind of crazy that you can get kind of similar quality Warhammer miniatures for a third of the price, sometimes even less than that. In a lot of comments and anecdotes, Leviathan was a big one that was mentioned for 10th edition. Certainly for newer hobbyists, there haven't been a ton of other options that can translate money into points on the board for either Space Marines or Tyranids quite as well as that, and doubly so if you happen to be splitting the box set with a collector of another faction. That essentially meant that you were paying far less than a combat patrol worth of value for far more than Games Workshop would offer in one of those boxes in terms of miniatures. Unfortunately, their current way of doing things seems that those sets don't really stick around too long. Maybe other particularly good recent examples could be the Indomitors box in 9th edition, a similar big edition launch box to Leviathan, Dark Imperium in 8th, and in particular the No Fear box set was also pretty standout in its own right. You got all of these Death Guard and Space Marines just for £50 or $80. There were more opposed miniatures like the other examples here, but still fairly mad that you can get basically two small armies, and the price tag for them was half the price of a combat patrol now. Currently on sale, maybe the single biggest discount kit is the 40k starter set. This one's the miniature focused one, without the rulebooks and terrain that you might want from the ultimate set, but in terms of money spent to models on the board, it's hard to beat that, again particularly if splitting the set in half. The existence of this in the Leviathan box was also interesting in pushing down the second-hand value of these miniatures. At least in early 10th edition, you could get things like a Neurotype going for £11 or $18 including postage, and Sarcophages and 5 Infernus Marines for even less than that. The price of these is all still quite good compared with what you might expect for how Games Workshop would sell them separately. Games Workshop has kept the battle forces coming as well, and occasional ones of these seem kind of standout. I think quite a few people got into Adeptus Custodes with the Watchers of the Gate battle force, around about 1500 points of models in one box there, which was massive. That one triggered me to put some Custodes on the table, as it was just too tempting to have an army that you could basically paint up quite easily for such a low value, even if you didn't expand it enormously from there. The one with Angron and the Exalted of the Red Angel was a good one for World Eaters as well. I feel like with a lot of these one and done box sets though, you do need to keep things in perspective a bit. They can be really powerful ways to save money, but you can also go too heavy on them. You just don't really want to be buying every single one of them that comes out, far more Warhammer that you might have bought otherwise. And it's probably worth bearing in mind that there's always going to be new shiny box sets coming out later. Shifting gears a bit, I thought I'd talk briefly about the video sponsor. It's run by a company called Only Games. They're basically a print-on-demand service for various 3D printed miniatures, and can be one way that you can get your hands on 3D printed stuff if you don't happen to own one yourself. What they wanted to share with me today was their Only Games Crate thing. where the general idea is to ship out some random entertainment purpose 3D printed miniatures, but it looks like it just so happens with the promotion that they're running, you can get a very cheap big-brained alien miniature here, which could maybe do for a good stand-in for a Tyranid Zoanthrope or something. For you Tyranid collectors out there, the normal idea of the subscription service is that it's usually £10 or $12 plus postage and taxes, and each month they send you 3 random 3D printed miniatures from a different feature creator of the month, just to give you some random goodies to paint up, with a little bit of excitement and entertainment as you don't know exactly what you're getting next. They've got a sci-fi and a fantasy one, and they give you a discount voucher for the creator of the month. On top of that, they gave perhaps a surprisingly generous discount code called Auspex Crate, which is why this one could be quite a good deal for Tyranids collectors. It basically gives you a single free month, and for that one you only need to pay postage and packing. Basically, the upshot of this is that if you use that code and subscribe for the month of September, the Sci-Fi Crate thing essentially gives you something that's about the same sort of size and shape as a Tyranid Zoanthrope for £6, €8 or $9 in the USA, plus another couple of infantry models as well. You get these 2 characters with a couple of machine guns. The miniature itself I think is pretty fun, quite a nice sculpture and it feels pretty detailed and impressive in person. Essentially that means for the month of September you can get one of these delivered to your door for £6, €8 or $9, which could be a saving that some Tyranid players might want to get their hands on, given that individual prices of certain other brain bugs out there run far higher. Might have interest to some of you out there at least. Otherwise they've also got a fantasy offering, again with the free month. If you subscribe any time in September, you'd get this trio of miniatures for that side of things. I feel like this guy could make an okay Inquisitor, swapping out that sword arm for an Inferno pistol or something perhaps. Or could just be a fun little painting project or a D&D sort of miniature perhaps. Otherwise, for the more general offering, obviously things get a bit more expensive, and the main appeal is more sort of entertainment value after that. Here's just a few examples of different creations they've had on other months for the sci-fi boxes. It is a bit random, and some things might appeal a bit more than others. I'd say the minis on the left panel out of these appeal a fair few more than the other two, at least to me. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. Could be one way for a few collectors out there to get their hands on a big spooky brain bug, a little cheaper than you might find them elsewhere. Back to the main video though, and let's talk through a few other things that are particularly considered to be good deals by 40k collectors out there. I feel like one thing that maybe goes a little bit underappreciated is exactly how much use you get out of miniatures. It's maybe a bit tempting to take a look at the Games Workshop stock price and see how much something is discounted by, and then just see it as a great deal, even if realistically it might be a miniature that's a bit more likely to warm the shelf compared with some others out there. For me, I feel like some of the best return on my money and my time modelling efforts have been a few of the real staple miniatures for certain factions that have magnetised with all the options. Certain kits are just incredibly flexible, particularly things like the Questoris Knights or the Lehman Russ tanks. You can field them in all sorts of wild configurations. I'd say out of just about any other miniatures in my collection, these have seen the most table time as a result, able to chop and change gear whenever they need it, when new editions, points changes, or new codexes come out, always having the best loadout ready to go, and in particular I feel like these tend to be particularly successful, as they're just kind of core units to their factions. The Lehman Russ tank is just sort of iconic for the Guard in general, and about half the datasheets in Codex Imperial Knights are different flavours of Questoris Knights, so with more miniature and a bunch of magnetised options, you've got the options to field a massive amount of things in the Codex. It might depend a bit as to what falls into those kind of categories for different factions as well, and admittedly certain things are far easier to magnetise than others. I perhaps feel like for Space Marines, having a Redemptor where you could swap out the arms and the carapace weapons for the different variants could be kind of powerful. They're hampered a bit by Games Workshop selling them all in separate kits. In any case though, I guess this might be kind of 2 points in one. Using a bunch of magnets can just make a collection a fair bit more resilient, able to roll with the changes as you go along, even if it does take a bit more time and hobby effort to magnetise and then paint up multiple options. And also maybe to skew a little bit towards faction staple units, the things that they're best known for, either being core damage dealers or perhaps some of their most iconic troops or elites. Typically on average they just tend to be a bit more likely to be relevant in game regardless of the edition. So it could be a way to focus time and money resources a little bit more on those staple units and maybe just a little bit less than otherwise on say spamming 3 of the same unique niche support unit that's very good this edition but might likely be left in the doldrums next one. Next up, let's perhaps do the most obvious one that tends to be a talking point online these days, and that's the whole idea of getting into 3D printing. If you have one set up and a process figured out and able to fairly speedily translate STL files into successful printed miniatures, it can be an incredibly powerful way to save enormous amounts of money on certain miniatures, plus give you far more options for different flavors of sculpt that you can have. Loads of creators out there making things that just happen to work with Warhammer 40k but are legally distinct sculpts, potentially printing entire armies for 40k or adjacent rule systems like one-page rules, far cheaper than they'd normally be. Plus are really good for things like aesthetic upgrades such as chapter-specific shoulder pads, certain war gear options, and other good applications such as custom bases with a bit of styling on them or terrain pieces. As ever, I'd certainly caveat that 3D printing isn't necessarily a great fit for literally everyone. Ideally, you want a room that's both got a stable temperature and is well ventilated, and certainly not where anyone's going to be breathing in resin fumes all day long. That doesn't sound like a sensible idea for your health. If free time is by far the biggest factor limiting your hobby, then trying to set up your own little mini factory might not necessarily be the best use of it. It might just be best to sock up a little bit of increased cost and focus on the actual painting and playing that you enjoy if you prefer that to making things. And of course, lots of people out there just prefer working in plastic or like the official Games Workshop sculpts and have no desire to be playing with lookalikes. For a whole load of people out there though, it's a fun little side hobby in itself, and once you do have a 3D printing process worked out, polished, and worked through any teething or troubleshooting issues, you really can make a lot of miniatures happen in a pretty short space of time for a very cheap amount compared with paying other people to make them for you. It's at least a fairly common talking point down in YouTube comments saying that you basically took the same cost as a Battle Force box set from Games Workshop, bought a 3D printer instead, and it saves me X amount of dollars so far. Maybe not too surprising then that a lot of people rate it as one of the best value things they've picked up for Warhammer or wargaming in general. Resin ones tend to be the go-to. Maybe the Mars or Saturn ones from the Elegoo range linked in the affiliate link below. There's loads of other options from plenty of other providers as well. Potentially doing a bit of seizing the means of production could be one of the best wargaming purchases that you make if you have an adequate place to run one and a bit of time to spare to do it properly. Next up, besides discount sets and 3D printers, when I asked you guys which were the best purchases that you'd ever made in Warhammer 40k, quite a lot of them were about scoring really big wins on the second-hand market in one way or another, and often does tend to be some of the best ways to get an absolute great deal, even if by its nature it's a little bit random what you might find, either occasionally on sale in the real world or online in various different ways, eBay perhaps particularly being a big one, maybe Craigslist, local area Facebook marketplaces, or all sorts of other social medias out there, Discord, subreddits and forums. In general, when a lot of people are trying to get rid of 40k armies, they just might not have the time and headspace to really go through all the process of trying to milk every bit of value out of it when they're trying to sell, maybe moving house, or just trying to clear out stuff that they're no longer using. It just means while there will be lots of things going for very sensible prices, just every so often you might find some absolutely crazy deals compared with what you might normally get. So it can be worth taking a look at new listings on eBay or browsing the different marketplaces out there. Plus sometimes when a friend wants to get rid of a different army, I think it is at least fairly common to offer some mates rates, maybe letting it go at a little bit less than it might have been worth if it's going to get played with by someone you know. Often if people are clearing out armies, they might be selling things as an entire job lot, maybe a bunch of miniatures that don't really make too much sense to be sold next to each other, or perhaps a big army that you might want some bits of but not others. If so, then it can be really quite powerful to be able to resell bits of that. Say for example, I acquired really quite a lot of my Cadian Imperial Guardsmen through various different eBay lots for the most part. I think it was fairly common that you might pick up 20 Cadians and a Sentinel and then resell the Sentinel for a significant proportion of the initial cost that you paid for the entire thing. And you'd wind up with some very cheap Guardsmen as a result if you're prepared to do just a little bit more legwork. Obviously all this is very variable and can be a little bit chance dependent. If you're really looking to get some of the absolute best deals on Warhammer though, it can just be worth keeping an eye on the various places that people sell second-hand minis, as every so often you might just have the opportunity to get something a lot cheaper than you otherwise should be able to. Maybe a slightly topical one at the moment are the Hachette Partworks magazines. It seems that since 8th edition came out, there's going to be one of these per edition of Warhammer 40k. Each one so far has been a little bit different to the last. The first one we had lots of Space Marines versus Death Guard, then we had mixed Imperial factions versus Necrons with a bunch of terrain thrown in, and now we've got the Combat Patrol magazine where it's going to be essentially 9 different combat patrols plus support, and all of these magazines runs have had some really interesting deals getting standard Warhammer miniatures for far cheaper than normal. often particularly in the first few issues, where issue 1 of these has generally been at £2 or £3, or around $4 or $5. And so far for the 3 magazines runs, we've had the 3 intercessors that you got in Conquest, not too bad for around a fifth of their normal price, plus getting some paint pots thrown in. Then we had the Lieutenant versus the Royal Warden in the first issue of Imperium. Again, crazy discounts on characters given that Games Workshop often sells those for £20 or more, so getting 2 for 3 were pretty massive. And the same is true of the Combat Patrol magazine this time around. Just in general, whenever these subs might come out in your area, it's worth keeping an eye on the different issues that get released, as you might just occasionally have things that go for far less than Games Workshop prices just because they happen to be packaged in a magazine. I want to say an Imperius Calgar for £9 with his Honour Guard, and similar for 3 Necron Scorpec Destroyers for £9 when they usually come in at like £35 or so. This time around it's the Combat Patrol magazine. This is currently rolling out in the UK. It's apparently going to be in the USA in spring, and should be coming to a bunch of other locations around the world, likely the places that stocked Imperium. So far we don't know the entire run of exact issues content, so we don't know the exact ones that are going to be the biggest savings, but already in the first 6 or so there's been 3 particularly interesting ones. £10 each, first for Terminator Captain versus Wings Prime, then £10 for 3 Von Ryan's Leapers, and then £10 for 5 Barb Gaunts. All of those are a pretty massive undercut on what Games Workshop sells them from normally. The first 2 you might find in supermarkets and WH Smith some places in the UK at the moment. The 6th issue with the Barb Gaunts is currently available to pre-order from Forbidden Planet, which is linked down in the video description. That's £13.20 if you want to snipe that issue in particular. Though if you're sure that a supermarket nearby might be stocking it, then you might be able to get it for £10 instead, and save on the delivery cost. You can just subscribe to the magazine's entire run from Hachette themselves, of course. It does save money on the combined cost of the models overall. It maybe feels a little bit tricky to mark out just as an overall value option, given that you're committing to quite so many miniatures that you might not have wanted those specific ones. Next up, for some other purchases that might have a bit more value than you expect, any kits that have a large amount of bits, parts and spares. They can be interesting for equipping other units to make sure we've got a good supply of all sorts of different weapons, and even kit bashing a few characters potentially. For Space Marines, I feel like the Vanguard Veteran kit is a particularly good one in terms of getting you loads of Thunder Hammers, Storm Shields and other fancy power weapons and cool armor bits. They can be pretty nice for kit bashing other things, including using a bunch of the parts on Primaris Marines too if desired. And if you build up the Vanguard Veterans with any one given loadout, you're still going to have plenty left over. The same is true for the recently retired Blood Angels Death Company kit. There might still be a few of those floating around in third-party discount retailers. Again, even if you assemble the Death Company in any one way, you are left over with a good number of Blood Angels heads and shoulder pads and other fancy things that could be useful for other conversions. There's probably a fair few more examples, but maybe another good one are the Sisters Novitiate from the Adeptus Sororitas, with all their cool relic weapons that they carry into battle. You get a pretty massive amount of options, many of which could be used to kit bash characters out there. You can rustle up a few support characters out of them. There's various bits that could represent things like an Imagifier, a Dialogus, or various war gear bits that the Canoness might hold. Basically, if you can make something that looks just about as cool or cooler than a Games Workshop bought character, and you can mount it on the right base and things, that can certainly be a very powerful way to save a bunch of money that you might have otherwise spent. You're basically upgrading a miniature into something that probably costs around about 6 times the cost of it, if not more. If you wind up trying something different to change your process on the painting side of things, and that winds up sticking and being the best way for you to paint models, then that could arguably be one of the best investments that you make in a hobby. One option that people feel can be quite good value is to diversify a bit away from Citadel, perhaps in particular for paints. While they are quite good for Warhammer miniatures and have good applications, using dropper bottles and a wet palette can be one way to save a fair bit on the amount of paint that you might use. Plus, getting good with an airbrush could be a big time saver as well. It could easily be worth the money investment and the learning curve. When talking about 40k deals in any way, it's usually just worth mentioning the standard discounts that you can get as well. Most people are pretty familiar with the Combat Patrol boxes for the different factions. Some of them tend to be a bit more standout than others though. I'd say in particular the Adeptus Custodes one at the moment does feel like it stands a fair bit above the rest. 5 Wardens, 5 Custodian Guard, 3 Terminators and a Blade Champion, all fairly solid and usable units for the faction right now. And just compared with virtually any other Combat Patrol out there, masses more points on the board. You could easily get 2 of those and just have a few units to finish up, and you wouldn't be all that far away from a 2000 point list. Along with combat patrols as well are all the third-party discount retailers. Again, generally pretty common knowledge for the most part. I've got a whole bunch of affiliate ones links down in the video description for various amounts of Warhammer all over the world. Lots of other good ones exist as well, and generally are quite nice to get a fixed percentage discount on top of an already discounted box set. Getting things like one of the better battle forces at 15% off or so can be quite a nice feeling when you're stacking discount upon discount for expensive plastic. Finally, maybe getting a little bit away from just pure good deals for the money. Sometimes I feel like it's just as important what you don't buy as what you do buy. As mentioned earlier on, things like limited edition, fear of missing out style box sets with good discounts can certainly make you make purchases that you might not otherwise have had. It's just important to remember that other good deals will come out in the future. You don't need to jump on literally every single one of them. Temptation can certainly come in other forms though, such as maybe going a bit too much into chasing the meta list and immediately jumping on each new combo as it becomes overpowered for it to get nerfed in turn, or just good old fashioned getting excited by new shiny things and maybe lacking a bit of focus as to collecting the army that you've mainly been trying to work up to. Otherwise, for a couple more honourable mentions, maybe good miniature storage and varnish can help preserve the value of models in the long term. You don't really want your miniatures to be getting damaged and I guess losing value, both to yourself and others, by storing them improperly. Varnish can be a good way to mean that you don't have to do repair jobs on your miniatures with paint as well, so it could be worth really quite a lot in terms of time saved for bothering to protect your miniatures. And finally, again, not really a deal, but something to be able to do is the ability to sell miniatures well. Be able to quickly list things on eBay without it being too much stress, or sell an army wherever else it might make sense to. And perhaps can be one thing that takes the edge off the overall cost of Warhammer. If you happen to play with miniatures, keep them intact, and then eventually decide that you no longer want that army anymore. You certainly don't want to be turning over armies all the time, as that will be a waste as well. But if you're absolutely certain that you're done with a collection, you can usually recoup a good 50 to 80% of the value, depending on how well you've looked after them and if you happen to be a particularly impressive painter. Unless Games Workshop invalidates miniatures or things get damaged, Warhammer does tend to hold its value really quite well. So you might be able to get back at least a few of those hobby dollars on leaving the hobby or an army. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. What have been some of your best purchases for Warhammer or Wargaming over the years? Whether that's discount deals, units that you've got tons of use out of, or hobby tools like painting supplies or 3D printers. A big thank you to Only Games for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out if you want a slightly unusually cheap alien monstrosity delivered to your door, or just want the entertainment of some fun miniatures arriving in the post each month for some painting projects. There'll be links down in the video description. In any case, I'll leave that one here for now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this, and if you'd like to help keep the videos coming a bit more directly, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, linked in the video description. That has a few benefits, including seeing certain videos early, votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry to the prize giveaways each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd like to support, the link's in the video description below. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.